All right, welcome everybody to the January 2025 edition of the Kentuckiana FileMaker Developers Group. Glad you're all here. If you're watching us on YouTube, we meet the fourth Tuesday of every month, and we are open to all. So be sure and check the link and come join us and in person. We'd love to have you. Today we've got Jillian who's going to do some presentation about some API integrations, and so I'm going to just turn it over to Jillian. There you go.
Hi, everyone. Okay, I'm just gonna stop my video and share my screen. And everybody see that?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So, just quickly about me, I'm a on-again, off-again developer. Decided a couple of months ago that I would try to focus more on FileMaker. So I've been fortunate to work with a couple of really great companies. But in between, I have worked with some automation tools that I found can be integrated with FileMaker. So you're probably all familiar with Claris Connect, but there are some gaps in what it can be used for. Number one of which, your solution has to be hosted on FileMaker Server. Secondly, it currently has a limited range of third-party cloud services that it supports. And the reality is there's still a lot of single-use FileMaker applications and clients still using peer-to-peer sharing that they may have a need to connect to the cloud, but again, because Claris Connect requires a server, that's simply not an option. And developing any kind of custom API or investing in plugins can sometimes be too expensive for clients. So my solution is working with an automation service called Make.com. I think it's a crazy name. They used to be called Integromat. They changed their name to Make. Don't know why. And just using the simple insert from URL script step in FileMaker. So what is Make? Okay, so first of all, again, it doesn't require FileMaker Server. You have options to connect to thousands of different cloud services, and they have pre-built modules for each of the different cloud services to do whatever kind of connection you need to make. I particularly like that if you look at this image here, their interface is very graphical. So for me, I find it easier to develop, they call these scenarios, because they use a visual representation. And I've done a lot of work for nonprofits and for clients that don't have a lot of money, and they do offer a free tier as well as very inexpensive monthly packages where it gives you an opportunity to kind of really be able to build very robust scenarios without breaking the bank. Now, the one caveat is that in developing a scenario, the trigger has to come from within FileMaker. So the initial insert from URL, that step, the process of your scenario has to originate in FileMaker. But I learned last month, not last month, then a month before, when there was a presentation on Auto FMS, which allows you to have a webhook on the FileMaker server side. So in that case, you would be able to create a scenario that's triggered from some other place, like say you're monitoring a web form, and then have that data come back to FileMaker. But I'm not going to demonstrate that because I don't have anything on a server, but that is something to look into if you want to utilize a cloud service that, say, Claris Connect doesn't currently support. So my first demo here involves QuickBooks Online. And I had a client that has a legacy vertical market system for the funeral industry. And I know that sounds strange to people, but they do manage a lot of data. And in the funeral industry, they don't have a need to kind of keep invoices because most transactions with a family only occur one time. So the information also, because it was an old system, is primarily a flat file. So a lot of the financial fields are all in one table, which makes trying to get totals or trying to create an invoice type layout system very, very complicated, and they've just never wanted to invest the money to do that. But they did have an internal process that would loop through all of the fields to gather totals for different types of transactions. So if it was a contract total, if it was a rebilling fee, if they had to issue a refund, etc. So they did have a table that had totals in it, but they're not related to any one customer. So in order to solve this issue of how can you connect QuickBooks to their system, the answer really was using journal entries. So if you're not familiar with accounting, in old-fashioned paper-based accounting, you had a journal, and you would, for every transaction, you needed to record the credit and the debit to keep everything in balance. Well, QuickBooks today is doing that in the background. Every time you put in an invoice, every time you pay a bill, it's doing that double entry accounting. And journal entries today are typically used to correct mistakes or to close out accounts at the end of the year. It's generally something that your accountant uses. But in this case, this was really the only way to actually get totals into QuickBooks. Secondly, because the transactions aren't going to be tied to any specific customer, I came up with the idea of creating a default customer to which all of these transactions could be posted. So what I needed to do was, one, retrieve the chart of accounts because I needed to grab the IDs of these accounts in order to map them to the types of transactions or the types of account transactions the totals needed to go into. I needed the ability to create any missing account types. Particularly, they have a total called bad debt. And in modern accounting, you're supposed to have an account for accounting for bad debt. And a lot of people who've had their books for a while may not have that particular account set up. So I needed a way for the tech support person who was installing this to not have to physically go into the QuickBooks account and create the account. They could do it directly from the application. They obviously were not going to have this default customer, so I needed a way to create the default customer and retrieve the ID. And then lastly, I needed a way to create a journal entry and delete journal entries should there be a need. So what the scenario looks like, I needed two different scenarios to accomplish this. So the first one, each one starts off with a trigger that is based on a webhook. So this is the URL that you put into the insert from URL script step. So that's pretty easy. Then we use a router module, which kind of acts like a case statement. So I send a query parameter called action, and depending on what the value is, it's going to take a different route. So if the action is accounts, it's going to take this route here to go and search the chart of accounts. If it says customers, it's going to take this route, etc. Then we're going to use QuickBook modules that do different things. So for example, this module here is for searching accounts. This one is for creating an account. This one is for searching customers, and this one is for creating customers. And the modules are fairly simple in what you need to put in them. You basically just when you install the blueprint or you create a scenario, you're going to be prompted to add a connection. And this is where all your authentication happens. So you don't have to continue to store this anyway or keep sending a token. You basically just say add, it prompts you to log into your account, and it preserves the connection forward. And then if you click on another module, you would just select your connection from that dropdown. So you really only have to make your connection one time. The next thing I needed to do, particularly on this account module, is I didn't want all of the accounts. Like, for example, I didn't need liability accounts. So I used a filter, which is in the middle of the path between two modules, to put in conditions. And pretty much every module, between a module, you're going to have the ability to put a filter. And you can do a myriad of things with these. This is just a very minor example. The next module is called an aggregator. And what's kind of cool about the aggregator is the information that is coming off of every module is essentially JSON. And the aggregator allows you to go through and say, well, I don't need every one of these elements. I only want the account ID and the name. So by the time you cut back to FileMaker, now you're just working with the data that you wanted. You don't have to weed through and go figure out which row item is the ID or the name. You just pull the information that you want. Then lastly, we use a JSON module to compile that array and then send that response, that JSON string, back to FileMaker. The second scenario was for creating and deleting the journal entry. It essentially works the same way, where I am passing action equals delete, and it's going to a different webhook. So when it's delete, it's taking this route. When it's create, it's taking this route. So on the create, I'm actually capturing the ID so that I can come back at any time and search for that journal entry ID in order to delete it. I was also capturing the doc number because it's an internal number that QuickBooks assigns that's actually different from the ID. So if you were to go in and look at your QuickBooks file online, like the actual QuickBooks file, you're never going to see the journal entry ID. You're only going to see the doc number. So it's a real pain in the butt if you're trying to make sure that your transaction went through. So I was capturing the doc number just so that visually I could check that the transaction actually went through, because you're not going to see the journal entry ID. So I'll just do a quick demo of what this looks like. So again, a lot of this, the process here was for the tech support person to actually install this into a client's system, because the company was not going to just include this for free. They were going to have to pay a setup fee to add this. So when I'm talking about accounts, I'm referring to the accounts in QuickBooks, like your sales income account, your rebilling. They have like a rebilling fee account, an interest income account, your cash account. So these numbers here are the totals that their routine pulls so that you can see what transactions happened in a particular day. So the setup process walks the person through putting in the webhooks to create the connection. It goes and grabs the chart of accounts, and then I have a method for them to map the transaction to the to map the debit and the credit transaction. And if there isn't a match, they'll get an error message here, and they can always create an account using this over here. So they map all of the accounts, and then we're going to import the customers. And this already matched because I've done this a million times, but If the customer wanted to map it to some other customer, they could pull it from the list, or again, they could create that default customer in order to select it here. And then running a test is going through and looping through that insert from URL to send each one of those totals and create the journal entry. So this, it takes about, it's about 10 transactions, and it records them in here, again, with the doc ID and the journal entry. Now, since this was a setup, we're going to delete all of those, and again, it's just looping through that insert from URL to go and find those IDs and delete them. So it has to do that a couple of times. Let's hope it doesn't, my internet connection isn't too slow. There we go. Okay. So that shows you that the history is empty, and now the customer is going, they're not going to see the setup icon, but the customer is going to have their button. So in the future, when they want to send their daily transactions to it, it basically does the same process. So Make.com has all of these modules for QuickBooks. So you can do any number of types of transactions. And if there isn't one on the list, they have one that's called Make an API Call. And I'm going to be showing an example of that a little bit later. But you can see that you really have a variety depending on the type of activity that you need to do in QuickBooks. So my second example involves ChatGPT. Now this is for the same customer with the funeral system, and they had a competing technology company that developed a web-based solution for families to use ChatGPT to write an obituary. However, the family would have to input all of the data. So since the system already has, for the funeral home, already has this data, in the past, they had a series of calculation fields that would write a very standard obituary. So-and-so, age such and such, passed away on this date at this time, et cetera, et cetera. So not very creative. So there's already data in the system. And since I knew that the insert from URL would work, I borrowed some of what that web-based one was doing and added the ability to assign descriptives, a tone, a style, and a creativity level before sending the information off to ChatGPT. So this scenario is very simple. It's just the webhook, the ChatGPT module, and the response. So in the ChatGPT module, again, you would make your connection, and you do have to have the paid version so that it can access the API. And then you can select which model of ChatGPT you want to use. And I chose to pre-write the prompt, to hard code the prompt into the module, but you could just as easily send it in your query string. The thing to keep in mind is when you use insert from URL and you're sending via a query string, meaning that it's the URL question mark value equals whatever, you can only have about 2,400 characters. And I built in an 1,800 character limit so that the user didn't exceed that. I have since learned that there is another way that you can send more information, which I'll be talking about later. So I hard-coded the prompt, and I'm passing the decedent's information, the creativity level, the tone, and if they set a word limit to the module. So we'll come back here, and oops, it's in here. So again, in their system, they would have already had a lot of information about the decedent because it was needed to fill out various forms, including the death certificate. And in this particular, for this client, in their solution, they had other fields for adding family members, adding additional information. And again, this initially feeds into that calculation field that they were using to write the obituary. So I just dovetailed off of this and added this bit. So I can select up to three descriptives of someone. I can set my creativity level. I can pick a tone. If I want to limit how many words it is, the reason they may want to do this is when you are buying an obituary to be printed in the newspaper, it can be very expensive, and newspapers do this by the word count. So if the family was trying to save money, the funeral home could put a word limit in here. That way, they wouldn't exceed their budget. And then lastly, once it's run, it saves all the previous versions so that they have options to go back to those. So when I hit generate, let's hope it works, it sends it off to ChatGPT. It sends it off to the insert from URL. This may take, see, it doesn't exceed the time limit. All right, there it is. So, and it shows me my word count down here. And every time I run this, I can go back and see a different version of the obituary to provide to the family. So very simple solution. And these files will be available for download. I have a URL at the end of the presentation. So on my last example, this is another QuickBooks example. And this is kind of embarrassing and funny, but for a long time, I maintained a spreadsheet that I affectionately referred to as months till broke. And this is because as a freelancer, I'd been a graphic designer and web developer for many years. Income was very inconsistent. And I always wanted to know, doomsday scenario, if I didn't have any money coming in, how long was my money going to last? And it was kind of a pain in the butt because of the way I have my QuickBooks set up, that I really couldn't generate a report. My business income was stored separately so I could run a P&L and get my business expenses, but then I'd have to run a special report to pull the personal ones and manually add all this stuff to the spreadsheet. And then it was often difficult to do scenarios, like say I was thinking of changing apartments and my rent was going to increase. How would that affect how long my money was going to last? Or say I'm planning for my retirement. I'd like to retire at 62 and I'm going to be making X amount of dollars from Social Security. How long will my money last? I know this is ridiculous. I'm ridiculous in terms of managing this. So I knew what I needed to pull from QuickBooks, and I discovered that retrieving check transactions was not a module that was available. So again, I have a webhook that's doing 4 different things. It's searching accounts for income, for debt. It's retrieving expenses and retrieving checks. But these two are make an API call. So this is a little more challenging to set up, but essentially with make an API call, in this URL field, you put in the type of thing you want to do from the API. So this is QuickBooks API, and these are all the types of entities that you could enter into that URL. So I put in transaction list. Oops. So that's what you see here. So that this is telling the module which one of those entities we're trying to pull. This is all preset. But then you have to develop what your query string is going to be. And how you determine that, again, looking at the API, these are the attributes that you can choose from for what you're trying to retrieve. And you can play around in this space here to make sure that you're getting what you want. So I knew that I wanted to query everything from the transaction list. I'm sending via my query string a start date and an end date. I want to only look at where the account type is a bank, and I want to only pull transaction types that are checks. So one thing I want to say is when you use the Make an API module, you don't get really clean JSON. If you look at what they have over here, your column data and your row data are separated. So you do have to do a bit of cleanup to match, to get key value pairs that make any sense. So that's a little bit of a struggle if you're not, and I wasn't that familiar with JSON. So of course I had ChatGPT help me. But at any rate, that's the one disappointing thing about that module is you do have to do a little bit of cleanup in FileMaker once you pull the JSON in. So this is my months till broke module. So when you start a new scenario, you can select what range you want to base your averages on. And in my case, I knew that I had made some big transactions that were going to throw my averages off. So I can put in a filter to filter out anything over a certain amount. And because I'm trying to estimate how long will my money last if I don't have income, I'm not going to fill out the rest of this information. So when I hit continue, it's going to go out and it's going to run that scenario to pull my data in. And I have less than 3 years left of money. I'm hiding some of my other numbers here. But under here is where I can specify my life expectancy, my age, and the age I want to retire, and how much I expect to get from Social Security. This also gives me a breakdown of what my average spending is across different categories. So again, I categorize every transaction. So whether it's a personal transaction or a business transaction, it's denoted in some form so that I can keep track of this. And then I can run scenarios. So let's just say, okay, somebody hires me, or I'm looking for a job, and I think over time my rent is going to increase. So I'm going to say that if I was making $30 an hour at 20 hours a week, and my budget increases by $200 a month, oh, look, I'm good. I can retire at 62 and I won't run out of money before I die. So, so that's what this does. If you're crazy like me and you want to track your expenses, that's what this application does. So here are a couple of tips. When you are configuring your insert from URL and you want to send more than the 2,400 characters in a query string, you can send up to 5 megabytes as JSON. The thing to remember is that the URL must be specified in the specify URL as well as in the curl command here. So you have to put it in twice or it won't work. The second tip is to plan for timeouts and trap for errors. Because this isn't being performed on a server, which it's my understanding it can sort of wait till it gets a response, you really have to specify a timeout and a maximum timeout so that the connection doesn't fail before it's completed. And the other thing I found is that you do want to specify error doesn't equal 0, because the curl sometimes reports a 0 as an error. And I just found that you needed to reference it that way. And I know a lot of people want to do invoicing. I did not create this scenario. I found it on this user forum. But you can see that the scenario gets a little more complex when you're trying to send something that has variable information. So an invoice will have variable line items. So what's happening here is you're taking the data that you're sending to it, and you're having to repeat through this information to compile it into a JSON that you can map with an array for the line items. If you knew you were going to just create an invoice with a set number of line items, then you could skip this and just map every one of your line items in that final module. But you have to pass it as an array to actually get the invoice to work. And if you're interested in downloading the presentation and all of the files and the make.com blueprints, here's where you can find them. So that's my presentation. Anyone have any questions?
Very cool.
Can you put that link
Very
up in the
nice.
chat, please?
Sure.
That's really neat, Jillian. Nice job.
Thanks.
Very nice job. Yeah.
Like that was pretty awesome. You
Yeah.
really incorporated a lot of everything in that one. So
Yeah, that
Thanks.
last one, I worked 3 weeks to build the Months Till Broke app. I had been wanting to do it for years. And so finally, now that I had my accounting on QuickBooks Online and I learned how to use insert from URL, it seemed like the perfect time to kind of build that. Although it's very depressing, I have to say. Looking at those numbers, it's very depressing.
it's funny you mentioned the variable like line items on an invoice, because the first time Connect came out, I do a lot of QuickBooks integrations, and I went to their connector and I saw that you actually literally had to hard code how many line items you had.
Well, you know,
And
that's
I
where
was so shocked.
well, yeah, that's what it appears to look like in make.com as well. It's just that all you have, I think it works the same way in Claris Connect, in that first line item, you just put an array in there. So you don't have to essentially map every single line item, but you have to build an array that represents all of your line items and then just put it in one line item. So QuickBooks in the API will be able to split that apart. Now, I don't know what that array needs to look like, but that's essentially how you pass multiple line items to that invoice module.
Might support that. I'm not sure Claris Connect would support that, but
Okay.
it would be interesting to. But that I looked at that and I was like, okay, done. I went back to my old way.
Yeah, I do the same thing, and I've used different things. I've used Proof and Geist one integrator, and I've used just Excel stuff for years that you upload. And I get the idea, and I could be wrong. And maybe Barbara and Jillian, you might know that we could take, how you have a header and you have line items in every invoice scenario usually. We could just take the line items, right, and put it in whatever format you're talking about, Julia. And then if you load those line items up, and I guess as an array, you're saying that will take care of it in QuickBooks, right? You don't have to load a header and the detail lines. You just load the lines and it takes care of it, right? Or am I wrong about that?
Well, let me just share.
My instinct would be go to the QuickBooks API documentation and look at the
Right.
invoice object.
See this on the right here.
Sure.
Okay, so this is what I think. Now, again, I haven't done this, but this is what your JSON is going to need to look like. And see how, again, they separate, QuickBooks is separating the column data and the row data. So you would have to, your JSON would have to be built this way, not the way we normally do it with a key value pair. You would have to send it this way for QuickBooks to interpret it on that particular module, on that make an API call module. The other modules are easier because they're building better. The JSON is cleaner. It's coming out cleaner because the module is already doing that for you. So, yeah, I don't know. I haven't played around with that. I've done other automations that don't involve QuickBooks. So you can, you know, there's a lot of, that's the other nice thing about Make is there are a lot of pre-built samples. So you can go in and say, well, I want to connect Twilio to Google Sheets. And you'll probably be able to find a sample that will allow you to do that. And they also have an AI chatbot built into their module there's your scenario creator. So as you're working on your scenario, you can ask the bot to help you. And it will literally put the modules on there that you need. So it's kind of really handy, and I've really enjoyed working with it. You can do lots of different things.
Can I ask you a question about your presentation?
Sure.
Thanks. You had a screenshot up of all the specific paths that Make would use with QuickBooks. Did it have a path for Make Invoice, or is that something you have to use the API for?
No, it does have a module for the invoice. However, by default, if you were sending data in a query string and you're going to have varying numbers of line items, you don't have a way to say, well, if I only send you 3 line items, only map to 3 line items. So I'm not sure if I'm explaining it well. Basically the line, it's not that the line items are hard coded, it's the number of line items is static. So if you know you're going to have 3 line items one time and 4 line items another time, you can't just say, well, I'll just put 4 in that module, 4 line items. You can't send a blank line item. So you can't just put like if you say the maximum number of line items I could possibly have is 10, and then not send data to one of those line items, the module won't work. That's why in that example I showed, the person built an array and only had to put it on that first line item. So the module only ever has 1 line item, but you're passing an array to that line item. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, not that I understand how to do it yet, but what you said made sense. Yes.
Yeah. So that's just the tricky part for that particular. And I know that's one that a lot of people want to do. I haven't had an occasion to play around with it, but that gentleman's example, I think probably would work. It actually might be more complex than you need to do, but I think you have to, if you could send the JSON already in the format that was needed to put the array in that 1 line item, then that's all you would have to do. You wouldn't have to do the iteration. You wouldn't have to do any of that. He was actually coming from a different data source. So his example wasn't coming from FileMaker. It was coming from an online database. So if your JSON was formatted correctly, you probably could just pass it to that 1 line item and then not have to do all of those other steps.
Sounds good. That was a great presentation. I mean that sincerely. You did a really good job. And that months till you run out of money, I try to call it cash flow, but that's basically what it is. Months till you run out of money. And I do the same thing in Excel, which is funny that we're FileMaker developers, but yeah, let me just check this out.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and it really comes down to how you manage your books. So I'm technically an LLC, but it's, pass-through entity. I don't keep a separate set of books for my personal expenses, but the way that you have to denote them in QuickBooks is they all fall under owner's draw, which means if I do cash flow report or balance sheet or P&L, those figures aren't going to show up. So I have a custom report for the personal expenses, and I would have to take those totals, make my average, and then do the same thing with the business expenses. So I was manually doing that in Excel, but now the database can do that. And then I added the extra features where I could do, like net salary. So I kind of, put my figures in for what my state taxes are and local taxes are, and it gives me a more accurate view of what my take-home pay would be. So any other questions about Make? I mean, I didn't really show their particular interface, but as I said, there is a free tier, and you can create 2 scenarios and do 1,000 operations a month. And an operation is every time a module is hit. So if you have a scenario that has 4 modules in it, that's 4 operations. But I think 1,000, once you have your testing done, 1,000 operations can be a lot, depending on how many users are hitting that webhook.
Kind of wish Claris Connect was a little more like Make, in some ways.
Yeah. I mean, I've only dabbled in Claris Connect, and there's another service called N8N, I think it's called, and its interface is similar to Claris Connect, where it's just like a stack. So you have line 1 is your first step and line 2 is your second step. I find Make's modules, it's just easy. I just find the graphical interface easier to understand and utilize. So that's what I really like about it. And the fact that it pretty much connects to just about every service that's out there.
I haven't had a good computer program since HyperCard, so that was that and my Schwinn Stingray at 12 years old. That was the height of life for me, those 2 items.
Wow.
Just kidding, of course, but I did like HyperCard.
Yeah, it could do everything, right?
Yeah.
I have a question. And I might have missed it because you did cover so much at once, and Jillian, it was so comprehensive. When I do QuickBooks integrations, of course, you're dealing with QuickBooks rules. Any integration. What about receiving edits from the QuickBooks side down into FileMaker? Is that something that you covered in your integration, or you were just pushing?
I was just pushing. As
Okay.
I mentioned that without having a webhook on the FileMaker side, like if you use Auto FMS, you can set up a webhook inside for the server to receive.
I know
So
that.
the
I work
only
for
way-
Proofgeist.
Oh, okay. So, but that's what I mean. Without that,
Yes.
no.
Yes, that is,
the
yeah,
way.
there's
So
definitely, you can have
could-
QuickBooks Fire off webhooks. We actually, for the QuickBooks integrations that we do, we use our file ledger link, which is the middleman between the two.
Right. So this is essentially
And
the
that
same.
does a poll. That doesn't actually receive, we don't support QuickBooks webhooks. They probably weren't a thing when he first built it. But you probably could have receive the webhook or pass it off into, usually we use just an inbox table and then process that JSON that came into the inbox. So it gets tricky. It gets tricky because you have to keep the 2 things in sync. So what if you received down the webhook, but it didn't process correctly in FileMaker? Now what do? You have to think all those scenarios in QuickBooks. Or really anything where you're trying to keep data in sync across 2 platforms.
Yeah, I don't know so much about syncing, but you can.
In sync, not so much syncing.
In my example, my first module was a webhook that's sitting and listening for something to hit the webhook. You can, however, create a scenario, and almost every one of the cloud services, there's a module for this, where the module is listening to send data somewhere. So for example, QuickBooks has a module where it can listen for a new invoice. So when an invoice is created, then you could send that to something else. And the same thing goes for if you wanted a module to listen to a Google Sheet. So when there was a new row on a Google Sheet, then your scenario starts, and you can put that on a timer. You could have it run at a particular time of day, or once a day, or every hour, or whenever it detects that something new has happened. So you can essentially create a trigger from whatever cloud service, as long as you've got a place to send that to. So I don't, it's not exactly like you're saying, wouldn't be syncing. The syncing would have to occur within FileMaker. So in FileMaker, you'd have to build a script that says, okay, this data is coming in. Does this match something that we have to update that? Like, did that invoice previously exist, or yada, yada, whatever. But the modules themselves can be a trigger to then invoke a scenario. Did that explain?
I know, very good. I just, yeah, exploring it, you realize you start going down a rabbit hole. Like, I received this JSON when I wasn't able to process. Now what? Do I revert QuickBooks? Can I queue it and process it later, or try again? So you get into scenarios like error code 0 usually means there was no error. So it's not like you won't get an error code. It depends on the service. Sometimes they always send an error code. Can be 0, 200 can be okay, 201 can be okay. So you have to, all the different rules. But like I said, it gets tricky if you can't try again, which is what our simple Q product's all about. Receiving in JSON, trying to process it, can't process it, it'll try again to process it. Maybe it encountered a record lock, things like that. I also love I'm always interested in uses of AI and the chat, and it's kind of a little sad that it's an obituary thing. That was sad.
Because some of the obituaries it's written are just terrific. Absolutely terrific.
But it's just, it's great to collect these little use cases so they get you thinking, like,
That could just have easily been, write me a blog post on this data I have for my client in my system. Like, it could be you, and actually,
Sure.
I hard coded the prompt. So you could literally send any prompt you want to that module and use it for anything. Social media posts, you want it to give you an idea about something. Yeah, so the options are kind of limitless as to what you could do with that kind of module. It doesn't have to be an obituary.
Sure. I will think beyond obituaries.
Although Jillian, I think you missed a great opportunity to make a joke there. I mean, you had they usually don't do more than one invoice line, and I think with the right timing, a good pause, and just a couple more words, you bring the whole audience in with that one. What do you think? Maybe I'm wrong about that.
I'm sorry, what did I miss?
You didn't miss anything. It's the quirky way my mind works. You made the offhand comment, which I found extremely funny. It was like, well, usually they don't do more than one invoice. And it's like, yeah, because the guy's dead. And then you said, because they don't come back for a second one or something like that. And it was just a good opportunity for you if you present again to.
I thought the same thing.
Yeah, right, Brian.
We all filled in the blanks on a joke there. Bad people, we are bad people.
Actually, the weird
Humans.
thing is that the decedent isn't actually the customer. So this is why funeral
That's
homes
true. It's hard to get them to
use
pay.
invoicing. The family member who is paying for it is the payee, but the case record is under the decedent's name. So this is why funeral homes don't use invoicing. They use a contract. That's their format for how they bill. So it's just a very different environment. They don't really use it. They don't use an invoice because there's also regulations by state as to what their contracts need to look like. So they
Interesting.
can't look like a regular invoice. So like you could have that in the background. Like if I were to redevelop this system, you would still have to be able to apply the invoice line item to make it fit into the format of the contract of the way it needs to appear for that particular state's regulations. So it is a very different kind of industry. It doesn't really work the same way that other industries work. But yeah, it's kind of fascinating how we don't, it's one of those things where the immediate thing you think about when you hear funeral home is the body and the service. And you don't think about all of the data and the business side of what a funeral home actually has to do. So anyway, I found it kind of interesting.
How are you,
Oh,
how
I
are
had
you,
oh, go
how
ahead.
are you cross-referencing your journal entries back to the source of the data for the journal entry?
How am I by date? So in the setup that I showed, well, here's the thing. In the setup that I showed, I did a bunch of dates because I needed a value for every one of those transactions so that the person installing it could make sure that everyone was posting. But on a day-to-day basis, the customer is running this report in the system only once a day. So these are a
Okay.
daily total, only run once a day. The system will stop them and ask them if they want to overwrite if they previously ran it for that date. So it isn't, so that the date is really the thing that keeps the transaction unique because there's only going to be one for,
One posting to that account per day.
yes, that's the way that it is. Yeah. So essentially what they do, it's like closing out your cash register at the end of the day if you were in a retail shop. So they don't, it's the end of the day, it's 5 o'clock, whoever does the accounts, they run what they call daily journal. It loops through all those flat files, those flat fields, and comes up with the totals. So now if you have this system installed, you would then hit the button to send it to QuickBooks because now you've got today's totals and today's totals are being sent. Now, if something should happen overnight, which is sometimes the case in the funeral industry, you get a call in the middle of the night and somebody accidentally went in and posted a transaction that same day, but now that was already run. So what happens is the system then allows you to go in and delete the previous journal entry because now you have to run the daily journal for that day again because your totals would have changed because that person put in an amount in the middle of the night. The day hasn't changed. So you're going to be missing a transaction. So they have to rerun it. It's a very old
Couldn't you just
system. There's not a way, there's not an easy way for me to, that's their process. That's
automate it?
Okay.
their process.
Okay.
You figured out what you could given what you had to deal with.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
the
Appreciate that.
whole financial system really needed to be rewritten, but they didn't,
Yeah.
they don't really want to do that.
Okay.
The part where you were running through the demo, the first demo with doing the journal entries, you wrote all those screens are in FileMaker. And it's kind of like a wizard program you wrote where you go from one screen to the other.
Yeah, that's because the fella that's the tech support person isn't, I mean, he knows a little bit of the FileMaker, but he's not a programmer, and he also doesn't know QuickBooks at all. So the idea was to make it easy enough for him to set it up without him having to call me. And
Yeah, it
so
looks
that
like
kind of
it's really
walkthrough,
easy.
yeah, the walkthrough was to make it easier for him, that he wouldn't have to remember all the steps, and it was a consistent experience every time that he installed it. And for the user, it's pretty much one button. They just click that button and it's only going to send, they actually, they have to specify a date. So there's a date field that they have to specify a date, and it will prevent them from sending more than one date at a time. So it's only really, they may only have 3 values to send, say, in a day. They may not have all 10 values to send because all of those types of transactions didn't occur that day. So say they wrote one contract, someone came in and bought something like a keepsake that wasn't on a contract, somebody needed a refund. So there were only 3 financial transactions that day. So now you only have 3 loops to go through to send that data. So it doesn't have to loop 10 times because there isn't always going to be 10 transactions.
It
It's a
makes
little hard
sense.
to explain, but that's
No, it
basically how it
makes
works.
sense. If you've had to work with accounting before where you make a journal entry, it, that's a common thing to do for some people, take an aggregate of a day's business, like you said, on daily cash. That's very common. Take an aggregate of the day's business and just post it, post against cash and post the sales tax and post the, cash on hand journal or whatever, and maybe move it to another place. So that's common. I thought it was very well explained what you did.
Oh,
But
thanks.
you got to be an accounting person too, where it's a nerdy business still.
It is, and I think
Yeah.
recently, especially since switching to QuickBooks Online myself, you didn't used to have the option of sending sales tax as a transaction. Like it had to be part of an invoice in order for sales tax to be inserted. But QuickBooks Online allows you to write to that sales tax account. So that really helped to solve a lot of the problems here because they're still pulling a total on sales tax that has to post somewhere. So I couldn't have built this solution until QuickBooks actually supported that. Because on the desktop version, there isn't any way to, well, they again fixed this, but there didn't used to be a way to directly write to a sales tax account. The built-in one, where you can
Right.
report over what sales taxes do. You didn't used to be able to get to that directly, but now you can.
Right. That was a big change last year, and what a pain in the neck it was too for a while because I would upload directly to the invoice, and QuickBooks would say, "Well, I think this guy belongs in another like tax bracket, and change it on me for a while." But because you have to set up a default for a customer to be either by location or by whatever it is, by location or by something else. Oh, you can override it. You can set a default. And for some customers, they may be in a location where their tax would be something and they're taxable everywhere else, but not this location because this is a resale account or something. So yeah, I had a little
Right.
trouble with that one.
Yeah, and the sales tax can be pretty complicated with funeral homes. Most states, most of your services are not subject to sales tax, but then if you sell anything like a coffin or a keepsake or an urn, then that part's taxable. Some states have it where the first $1,500 isn't taxable, and then anything over $1,500 is taxable. So their system, they calculate for that. They have customers in all 50 states. So the sales calculation in the system is already able to do the sales tax. And so I only need to pass the totals to the appropriate account. And actually in the customer's version, not in the demo, there was an option to have, if the person had 2 different sales tax accounts, that you could map for those. So I just didn't put it in the demo because it was more complicated than what what you needed to see.
Yeah, you were just showing us how to use make.com and some of the features of it, which is great. I think it has a place. It is too bad you can't trigger some things, but it certainly is an interesting piece of software.
Yeah, well, like I said, if you use something like AutoFMS, which is free, you could put a webhook on your FileMaker side and then use what's called an HTTP module to send the data back to FileMaker. So you could
So-
have you could start a scenario that gets triggered from some other location. Like, again, somebody added a row to a Google Sheet. And you can come across your scenario to send that data to FileMaker if, again, you're using something like AutoFMS that you've got a webhook to go to.
So in other words, the webhook would be generated by the Google Sheet or by QuickBooks because they have that trigger, that webhook that you could
Well, it's
make in
not,
the
in that case,
program.
it's not a webhook. So again, I didn't show an example of this. It's just a module that has a trigger, that is a trigger.
Right.
So the trigger is sitting there listening. It's a listener, not a trigger, really. The module is sitting there listening for something to happen via that API. So if it's QuickBooks, the module is sitting there listening, say, for a new invoice. That module is sitting and listening. And then your scenario is going to engage when it detects that has happened. So it's not really a webhook. It's the API. It's a module that is able to listen for something to happen. Whereas my scenarios were being triggered by a webhook. But you don't always have to start that way. You can start with any kind of trigger module.
Yeah, I'd have to see that. I'm not as familiar with that. That's very interesting, Jillian.
I mean, I can I don't know if I can show you quickly here what I mean by that. Let me log into one of my accounts. Come on, here we go. Create a new scenario. All right, so where am I here? Share my screen. Okay, so this is what it looks like when you start a scenario. You get a big purple button, and you're going to pick whatever app it is that you want to be your trigger. So let's say I'm starting from QuickBooks. So I can start with an event, and this is going to listen. So you're going to create your connection to QuickBooks, and it's going to listen to QuickBooks to start your scenario. And you can do that with literally any application. So if I were to, I can't even get rid of this, delete this. So again, like here, watch for new rows. So all this does is I create my connection, and I can say, check in at intervals, or I can put in at a certain time of day or a certain time of the month. And that then triggers the rest of the scenario. So there's no webhook in here. It's your connection to whatever it is that you're connecting to. And then you can do something like, get a file, make a request. So you could put in a, so I could grab, I don't know how this works, but essentially you can create a way to send it back to FileMaker from within here. I'm not sure if you use the HTTP one, or you'd have to use, I don't think you can use a webhook here because it's I think you would just put the webhook in here, but this is get a file, so it would have to be like to put a file or something. Let me see what the options are. Make a client, make an API request. Okay, so it's probably like make a request. So this would be then communicating back to FileMaker. Now, I don't know if you can attach information to that and make it like a query string. I haven't tried to do that, but essentially that's sort of how that would work.
Yeah, it's pretty promising. Actually, I should have opened automatic and looked at that because I don't understand. I mean, I use automatic and I know that it has that webhook capability, but I don't understand what I've never made a webhook in there. And maybe automatic generates that URL. Maybe Barb would have known if she was still on, but let's see. I'm just curious. And that completes the round circuit then. I mean, that makes the whole thing complete. If you can listen, right? You got make listening for the event, and it triggers a send URL or whatever. I mean, maybe you can send the URL right to QuickBooks, like you said. I mean, right to FileMaker. But even if you can't, what is this automatic webhook concept? Is it something that we can send? It generates a URL that it can send to, and it'll pass on.
In automatic, when you set up a webhook, that's what automatic is doing. It's generating a URL that you copy, and then whatever app or system that you're integrating with, wherever they have the availability to put in a webhook, then you paste it in there. And that's all there is to it. It depends on what you're integrating with. I just did a bunch of work last week. Um, Honestly, I converted using Claris Connect and converted to using Auto FMS, the webhooks, and made that change to where now I've kind of taken Connect out of the loop, and I connected with WooCommerce and WordPress and with Stripe and set up webhooks to send that data back to Auto FMS that then drops it into a table in whatever FileMaker file you've set up that webhook to drop it in. So.
Okay, so the webhook in automatic is set up kind of like the execute FM DAPI or something where you put a layout out there and the webhook is connected to that layout.
Well, the way Auto FMS is set up is they actually have a very easy way of doing it where um, they have an add-on that you can use. So you put the add-on in your file and it creates the table and the layout and the script for receiving that JSON payload from the webhook. And then
Okay, and then you do whatever you want to do with it.
right, then it's up to you to write the scripting to pick up that JSON payload and do whatever it is that you need to do with it.
So looking at what Jillian just showed us, is there a way to incorporate that? Or is it even necessary? Maybe we would just go directly to Google Sheets or something.
I kind of got a little lost because I was working on some other things. I hate to say it, but got
No,
some
no, it's
that I wasn't paying enough attention. But I mean, it's basically completing that round circuit. So you've got something that sends the data to wherever you're sending it to, but then if the data up there gets updated, then you have the webhook gives you the ability to retrieve changes that are made in the other system to send those changes back to FileMaker.
so what Ron just, I mean, maybe you'll know that if this leads us off topic, I'll stop. But Jillian was just showing us that she can create a listening in that module in the whatever that thing is called, make.
Yeah.
She can create a listener, right? So, for example, she could create a listener with Google Sheets or with QuickBooks or any of those, and it listens, and then it gives her some actions. Can you show them the actions again, Jillian?
One second.
There's like
It's
a list of actions, Ron, that she can do.
Right.
Oh, well, yeah, there every I was just experimenting with this to see if there was
Oh, okay,
another
sorry.
option under webhooks.
So that kind of seems like an extra piece that is unnecessary when you have Auto FMS and you can just send that directly to Auto FMS.
Right, but you need
Okay,
something here to send to. I don't personally know what module needs to go here to send it back. Do you see what I mean? Like, I don't know what that is.
Yeah.
I think it
I
might
guess
be
it-
HTTP, but I don't know. The other thing I wanted to mention is I shared in the chat N8N, and I know someone that's been working with that, and I think that that's another automation service. I think they have a module that sends to FileMaker. So that is more a direct alternative to Claris Connect, but it hasn't been around as long as Make. I haven't played around with it, but yeah, I was just trying to see if there was some other kind of module in here. If I put API.
I guess the nice thing about what you're showing us, this listener in Make, might be the fact that, they've got all these predefined modules that you can listen for different systems. Whereas doing it manually, for instance, with a webhook, you have to go to each system and figure out, okay, so now where do I put in the webhook and how do I define what actions to listen for and all of that stuff, which, can be really tedious. Because everybody does it differently. And so it looks like the benefit of what you're showing us is probably a standardized, format of how to do it. And you just pick the system that you want to integrate with, and you've got the ability to kind of set it up from there so that you're not working in completely different environments with every system that you're trying to integrate with.
Yeah, you could learn this once and you'd have a well-worn path. The other thing I'll just quickly say, there's some things out there that don't have webhooks, and I was wondering if what Jillian is showing us is saying, hey, everybody that make.com supports, we can mimic or imitate a webhook by, or does it only use ones that have webhooks? That,
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
I was thinking about that too, because as you said, not every system, you log into your control panel on a system and maybe they don't have any place to put in a webhook, but maybe
Right.
there's a module.
Can I barge in and explain a little bit to you guys?
Yes, please do. Please
Yes.
do.
Yeah,
But tell me how to say your name first.
Yeah, it's Jeroen.
Yeah, thank you.
That's okay. But what Jillian was showing you on the right side of the Google Sheet are basically all the apps that are registered with make.com, right? So any app that has somehow an API connection, incoming or outgoing, is registered there or is available there. And that all depends on the make.com, how much they basically offer to you, right? In the beginning, Connect didn't offer us anything almost, because especially in Europe, we don't use Quicken or QuickBooks or any of those applications. We use Exact, right? So that's a financial system in Europe. Connect wasn't offering Exact, so we couldn't use Connect that much. But so more and more parties, more and more applications are getting into these middleman systems, what actually Zapier, Connect, and Make are. And then any party that basically offers API, and basically a FileMaker should do the same, but in the end, only the MBS plugin offers us actually the ability to offer also a webhook, which is basically a listener, right? A webhook is a listener, and if you have the MBS plugin, you could simply in the MBS plugin call a function, say listen as a webhook, and your server is then at that moment listening as a webhook, right? So that's a listener to any party outside that is offering some kind of link. Well, that is quite dangerous, of course, because anything you send can be intercepted. So most of the time, the sending party send only a very small piece of information, maybe an ID. That ID is caught by that webhook, right? FileMaker listens, or in this case, not FileMaker, but the MBS plugin listens. There's a call coming in, creates a record in FileMaker. You read the data, obviously most of the time a JSON format, right? You grab that piece of data, and then you do an outgoing call, because then you're authenticated against the system that sent you that webhook, and you say, okay, I got this message from you. This is the ID. now with my authentication and that ID, give me that information. And then you pull in the full set of data that you get, right? Ordinary old webhooks basically did send in bigger pieces of data, but because they were intercepted a lot, and nowadays webhooks are really thin. Basically, they only accept some basic information. And indeed, I think what was said before by Ron, you have a webhook URL basically, so that MBS plugin that says, okay, from now on, your FileMaker Server /MBS webhook is your URL, and you give that to another party, and you say, here you go, this is my, my post box, basically, right? Send me anything you have at some moment in time, and they will send you a hook, basically. That webhook is a call, actually, and that webhook collects that call and says, hey, I got a call from QuickBooks or from MailChimp or any other API, right? And now I'm going to do my action. Is that a kind of clear what I'm trying to say here?
Yeah, it is. And are you saying that many of these now have webhooks? Like, they all have APIs and have for years, but there's a lot of them doing the listeners now too. I mean, that's not an issue anymore.
Every serious party, if you look through the documentation of the API endpoints, right, that normally are with an API set, at the bottom, 9 out of 10 have a webhook API endpoint there. And that's actually just basically the other way around of the API calls, right? The API calls are gets and posts that you initiate. Right. And the webhook is just a listener that is waiting for incoming data. Yeah.
Right. It's a trigger, I guess.
No, it's not a trigger. It's a waiter. It's waiting. It's waiting. Okay. Sorry, waiter. Not an English waiter. It waits till it gets a signal. So it's a listener. Sorry, it's a listener.
Okay.
It waits until it gets a signal, and then you can do something with that signal because you knew where that signal was coming from, right? So what Jillian, I think, was showing you was she created already a webhook by creating that Google sheet. Make.com is now acting as a webhook for that Google sheet. So when the Google sheet is making a change, Make.com receives that change. It says, hey, I got a change from that Google sheet. Where do you want me to push that data? And of course, now, if FileMaker would have done its job, if Claris would have done its job, it would have made sure that in Zapier and N8N, in Make.com, they would have offered us the apps basically for FileMaker. So FileMaker should be, and actually in Zapier you can find FileMaker. There is a third party that built basically an app for Zapier. And I think I don't know, Jillian, if you did the search for FileMaker, but normally in that right hand side you would look for FileMaker and hopefully find FileMaker there as a app, because that app basically then connects to your API, data API, right? Because that's basically what it is. The apps are only data API. What is helper agents, right? So
facilitator, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Facilitators, yeah.
Currently, Make does not have one, but N8N does.
Has
I
one.
wasn't aware that Zapier does, but I mean, if enough people reach out to Make and tell them that they want a FileMaker one,
correct.
They will probably for you.
Yeah. They will probably make one, and basically we built all on my company's logics, but we build our own APIs, right? And we don't use these connection platforms. They are really easy, but if you make it yourself, you can connect basically also, right, from your postman to FileMaker, and basically that's what it is. They created a little sort of postman helper. You give that postman helper something, and it connects to your data API, and that's that helper that should be in that Make.com. And unfortunately, obviously, it's not there. So I think, Jillian, there is an arbitrary API caller in there. So there you can still define your own API. So if you then give that app your client ID and everything from FileMaker, right? Your credentials from FileMaker, you can, with that app, you can still reach FileMaker through ordinary API, data API. Did you check if you could find sort of arbitrary, some general app in there? Most of the time they have a set of standard apps, right? So you see all the companies coming by with their apps, and then somewhere in there, there's probably sort of general app, and that those apps you can.
She showed us one. She showed us one.
Okay.
Make API. Yes.
Yeah, Make
Right?
API or something. Yeah, if you use that Make API one, you can probably create your own set of rules in there and still connect to your FileMaker app.
Right. Jillian, that's a good idea too, Jillian, what you're showing.
Clean out
create
if
an
you
app.
Test an app or create use an HTTP app or create an app would be your two options here.
Yeah, and if you clean out that search box from FileMaker and you just
There's not
type
one.
in API or something.
Yeah, no, I tried that before.
Make an API
Okay,
call
sorry.
at
If
the
you
top.
type in something that it doesn't have,
Yeah,
then
make
you can get to
okay,
this.
one back. You saw Make
Yeah,
API call.
do it
indeed.
again. I think that works. Yeah.
Yeah. You
This is what
skipped
it would
one.
be.
Can you go back one step?
No, what you were seeing was QuickBooks. When I put in API, the first thing that came up was QuickBooks.
Oh, okay,
No, the one-
okay. Sorry. Yeah.
That's-
Oh, I see. Those are all QuickBooks.
This would be your option, because here's where you would put in
An endpoint,
an endpoint.
and there you do a post or
doing
something.
right, and then you could attach.
Yeah, adjacent.
Whatever was coming
Yeah. That's it.
So that's how you would do it. I never
Okay,
tried to
that's
do
it.
because I don't have a server.
Okay.
We could get deep in this. I don't want to hold people up, but I have to ask you. So, if you're using MBS, and Jillian's using Make, what is the webhook and automatic? Would that be a replacement for the MBS in a sense? In other words, instead of having to call the data API, like what Jillian was showing in that HTTPS, there is the webhook, is the automatic allows you to,
Automatic is residing on a server, right? So anybody with server, we have our own webhooks. We program webhooks in PHP. So if you have a server, I can give you a PHP file. That PHP file on your server, you hook it up to FileMaker, and any endpoint that you call to that PHP file, because your server obviously has a HTTP server in itself, right? It's an internet server. So if you call that PHP file, it will grab your data and it will push that data to FileMaker, and that's it basically.
But
And
I'm thinking,
made a nice
of
piece
the
out
other
of it.
way. But Auto has something for this way. Instead of going out with the get post, through to an API and getting and bringing back, Auto has something where it seems to have said, if I remember, that instead of you having to give your credentials to a webhook like QuickBooks or Google Sheets, like Jillian's showing us,
But
I will set
it's
up.
not a webhook, huh? That's not a webhook. The webhook is always on your end.
Yeah. Okay. So what I'm saying is, the webhook, it's allowing within Auto, it's allowing you to create a webhook, a listener that it will pass it on to the server for us, which sounds a little bit like what you're using MBS for. I may be wrong, but it sounds like where FileMaker did not give us the ability to do webhooks, Automatic is giving us that ability as this add-on piece in server management. And it's not an outgoing; it's an incoming. It's a listener.
That's correct. It's an incoming.
Okay.
All the webhooks are always incoming. Webhook addresses. It's like I give you, if I have my post box outside, I tell you this is my address. So I take the address from my house, I walk to you and I say, this is my address. If you want to post something to me, post it to this address. And my post box is just waiting there for mail to come in, right? So as soon as it's coming in, Otto is passing it on to FileMaker. And that's basically it. So Otto, because it's a server with FileMaker databases on it, it will pass that information on. So basically it says for every unique user on that server, this is your mailbox, this is your mailbox, this is your mailbox. Basically, this is your webhook, this is your webhook, this is your webhook, and you can just give it out to any party or piece of software that you want to use it for. And since you, of course,
This is enlightening. This has gone up deeper. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah,
this
since
is great.
You'll probably have different external programs pushing data to you. There are one of two things, or you create different webhooks for every different third party that you want to collect information from, or you do one webhook, and then within the webhook, you need to do some kind of if-then statement saying like, okay, if this kind of data comes in with type blah, 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 then pass it on, dispatch it left, and otherwise dispatch it right. To a script or something. And I think you guys had Better Forms, FM Better Forms in one of the sessions before, right?
Yeah,
Better Forms has the same. Yeah, it has an API listener, and you can just, so any account with Better Forms has an API listener that you can hook up any incoming data. He was talking about that helper file, right? That in-between file between FileMaker and Better Forms. So any call that comes into Better Forms API will be passed on to the helper file, and the helper file will pass it on to FileMaker left or right or whatever database that's underneath.
Brian
So
just posted something too. Brian just posted something to the chat about the N8N FileMaker integration.
Yeah, that exists, right. But be aware that many of these connectors are pretty limited because they not always offer the full set of endpoints, right? So that might be, if it works, it works, but sometimes it's limited.
Yeah, if you can roll your own, you're better off. If you could write your own like you do, that you're better off. But for some of us, this is, we're still, we're not even walking, let alone running yet, but we're starting to walk a little.
Yeah, there are definitely, I mean, it's getting to the point, there are just so many different options when you're looking to integrate with systems, whether you're sending outgoing data or bringing in incoming data. Like there are so many different options. For instance, the Kentuckiana database for managing this group, I elected to go data API. And so all the data is getting processed on the website, being sent directly to the FileMaker file. Any information that's changed on the FileMaker file like that information is being pulled up and displayed on the website. So that's kind of a direct connection between the web pages and the FileMaker file.
Right.
But, the luxury of doing that is if you're custom coding your own stuff, whereas if you're using plugins like WooCommerce and things like that, you can't go in and write that into their plugin. You have to use what's available, which for them is, the ability to put in a webhook. And AutoFMS does a really nice job of kind of simplifying that process of making the connection and dumping the data. And then, of course, it's always up to us what to do with the data once it gets into the file. But their webhook system is very nice for simplifying that process of generating a webhook that you just copy and paste into whatever system you're integrating with, and it just
and be aware, because that's really good practice, is making it a round trip, right? So you get a webhook in, that's basically a signal. It's a replacement for the fact that in early days we had only API calls, and we were like polling all the time, right? Do you have information for me? Do you have information for me? Do you have information for me? Every half hour, we were trying to reach another system and say like, are there any new orders? No, there are not. So the webhooks are saying actually, hey, I got a new order, ping, and you get a message in, right? And then you grab that webhook ID from the system that sent you that information. And then with an API call, you get the full information. And that is then authenticated and much more safe than having that webhook push a full set of information to you, because the webhook is basically ditched into the world with anybody can be the receiver, basically, right? When somebody fakes your network.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you should never use these make.com sites and say like, oh, I'm going to push a whole set of JSON to the other side, because that is dangerous.
You just push the whatever they send you naturally, the ID, the thin, as you called it before, the thin. You take that and you say, okay, I know I got something, and then you go back out and do your retrieve, your get call to their
And your
API.
API call, you say, hey, you just sent me a signal with this ID. Give me now the full information. Yeah, correct.
Nice.
Oh, thank you very much for sharing that. That's really good to know. I was not aware of that. I would have just taken this stuff across the HTTP and or to HTTP. I would have done that.
Yeah.
And then Jillian, you brought up that a lot of your people don't always work on servers. So I mean, having the ability for Make to do what you're showing may be very crucial for you. And I'm not sure how. If I guess you could just send a thinner piece back, the signal, and then do an API call from within the client FileMaker, of course, I guess. But I don't know. I've been working with the server so long, but automatic is a server piece, so it wouldn't work for some of your clients. But what you're saying,
Well, right. I mean, I think that the beauty of Make, because Make is giving you the webhook, I don't have to be on a server. I can, that month's till broke app, well, actually, both of those demo files were running locally. So just using insert from URL, going out to that URL, my authentication is all happening on the make.com side when I configured my QuickBooks module. So I'm not having to store or pass any tokens or manage any of that in FileMaker. That's all set up on Make. Make gave me a URL, my webhook, to send my data to. And it's an HTTPS, so they have built-in security in terms of sending the data. It's certainly not like the REST API that the benefit you get from the FileMaker server, but you do have a modicum of protection sending over HTTPS. I certainly wouldn't be sending like social security numbers or something this way, but for the data that I was sending, I think was safe enough. There wasn't any.
well, we all use these things. So if they're not safe, I mean, you're not the only one in this bucket.
Oh, no, I mean, the server gives you encryption at rest. HTTPS doesn't give you encryption at rest. The
I
server
see.
itself gives you encryption at rest. But again, I think that there are plenty of situations where you may build something for yourself and it doesn't need to be sitting on a server, but you want to go and grab something. You're monitoring your Facebook feed. You're, I don't know, whatever you're doing, and you want to be able to just go and grab it. That's really what the appeal was, particularly in the case of the funeral home software. The majority of their customers are not using server. If they have a multi-user environment, they're still using peer-to-peer. So different environment, certainly not the best, but that's what they had. That's what they have.
Yeah, no, this has been great. I really appreciate you doing it, Ron and Jillian, and you guys sticking in and letting me listen, because this helped me a lot in projects I'm working on right now.
So there's
So thank you.
one of the other caveats about the situations that we're talking about and the scenario with Make and everything. If the file is not on the server, the only thing you can do is request the information when you want to request it. The difference between that and a webhook is that the webhook is sending that information when you're on a server. Your database is always open and always there. And so when a webhook is in place, that data is reaching your FileMaker server, whether your FileMaker file, whether you're in it or not. That happens, you don't have to touch it. But if you're not on a server, then there's no way there's no way for any system to put data into your FileMaker file if the file isn't open. So, with Make and being available to use when you don't have a server, you're still kind of limited to manual processes where you go and request the information or send the information manually by clicking a button. Like you may have automated the process with scripting and all that kind of stuff, but ultimately it's on demand as you go in and you trigger those things and do those things. Whereas the beauty of webhooks is that information just gets delivered to your file and goes right into, on the server side, the script picks it up and does whatever you need to do with that data. And it happens, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as long as your FileMaker server is up and running and your file is open on the server. So.
Yep. Oh my.
Makes your head swim
Well,
to these deep
yeah,
dives.
it does. But it was really good. And I just realized I got to run. But this has been wonderful. So I'm going to cut out. But thank you guys. Thank you, Jillian.
Take care.
Thank you, Ron.
You're welcome. And thanks again, Jillian. I guess at this point, we might as well go ahead and shut it down. So thanks everybody that's still hanging in there. And thanks, Jillian, for your participation in your presentation.
Thank you, Jillian.
Yes, thank you,
Yeah,
Jill.
thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Yeah.
All right.
Y'all have a great day.
Bye.